My name is Dayton Williams, and on this week's episode of Along the Wolf Trail, we're on site at historic Fort Mims. Tucked away in the Tensas backcountry lies this small 1-acre fort situated just northeast of Boatyard Lake. The fort was erected around the plantation home of Samuel Mims in the summer of 1813. Here, the Tensas residents could find shelter and protection from the uprising faction of the Red Stick Creek Indians. In August of 1813, the fort was home to some 500 men, women, children, mixed blood Creeks, and enslaved African Americans. Crammed inside the small palisade, the inhabitants were soon to realize the protection that they so desperately needed would not be enough to keep them away from the hostile Creek Indians. Here in this very swamp, 211 years ago, a horrible massacre took place on August 30th of 1813. Nearly 750 Red Stick Creek warriors attacked the fort at noon and left very little survivors. How did a force of Creek warriors destroy a fort that was manned by military and militia soldiers? A fort that was supposedly well built and could withstand the worst of battles. Still to this day, many people wonder if the incident was avoidable. Who was to blame for the massacre here in this swamp? Today, we will begin to dissect one of three characters that was here on that gruesomely hot day in August of 1813. Born in 1768, Daniel Beasley was a native of Virginia, but moved to the Natchez area of the Mississippi Territory in 1803. In 1805, he was appointed sheriff in Jefferson County, and he held office there until February of 1813. His duties as sheriff included arresting suspected felons, capturing escaped slaves, meting out punishments, and serving warrants. In 1810, Beasley partook in a duel along the Mississippi River, and it most certainly earned him the renown he so desperately sought. Many people who knew him thought of him to be brave, chivalrous, and frank, but the inhabitants of Fort Mims, well, thought otherwise. General Ferdinand Claiborne, who was situated at Fort Stoddart, called upon the late sheriff to take command at a vulnerable outpost in Creek Country. With this order, Beasley left the Natchez region and pointed his horse east towards the Tensas swamps. On August 2nd, at 41 years of age, Beasley and his 1st Regiment of Mississippi Territory Volunteers set out from Fort Stoddart, which was located on the west side of the Mobile River in present-day Mount Vernon, Alabama, with 102 infantry and 10 mounted dragoons. They arrived at Fort Mims on August 3rd, and with their arrival, the fort began to experience severe overcrowding within the small stockade. Beasley's attire at the time of Fort Mims is not a well-documented topic. There is much room to speculate what the major would have been dressed like, although we can make an educated guess with the facts that we have before us. With him being a new major in the militia and not the regular army, I suspect him to not have been dressed in a military uniform, but to have been dressed similarly to how he dressed serving as sheriff. Riding boots, a cool pair of trousers, and a cotton or block printed shirt with a red sash, as a statement of leadership among the people inside the fort. Before the attack on Fort Mims, General Claiborne arrived at the congested acre to inspect the fort, and he immediately ordered the new Major Beasley to correct some of the fort's deficiencies. These deficiencies included finishing the current blockhouse, reinforcing the picketing, and for them to build 2 additional blockhouses. Not to mention the portholes were placed 3.5 to 4 feet off of the ground, so that the people on both the inside and the out could fire into and out of the fort, where typically the portholes would be placed 6 to 7 foot off the ground with firing blocks underneath them, so that the people on the inside could fire down on the people on the outside. Days before the 30th, reports of hostile Creeks in the area came flooding through the gates of Fort Mims. Most of these claims were from the enslaved African Americans who belonged to the Tensas residents stationed inside of Fort Mims. Beasley began to believe that the enslaved people were falsely reporting the sightings to get a reaction out of the already petrified inhabitants. The morning before the attack on Fort Mims, Beasley sat down at his desk located inside the halfway completed blockhouse to write up his morning reports, addressed to General Claiborne. It is in this letter that we find Beasley to have been in a complacent state of mind, not knowing what dangers lurked just outside of the walls of Fort Mims.
Mims Blockhouse, 30th August, 1813. Sir, I send you enclosed this morning report of yesterday of my command, from which you will perceive from having ordered from this place a good many of those who came up with me, and also in having scattered my command in so many places that you render me unable, if the Indians should appear in any force, to do anything more than to defend several forts, that I should be utterly unable to leave the fort and meet any number of the enemy, more especially when you know that but a few of the volunteer militia can be relied on. I have improved the fort at this place and have it much stronger than when you were here. There was a false alarm here yesterday. 2 Negro boys belonging to Mr. Randon went out some distance from the fort minding some beef cattle and told that they saw a great number of Indians painted, but the alarm has proved to be a false one. What gave some plausibility to the report of the Negro boys at first was some of Mr. Randon's Negroes who had been sent up to his plantation for corn and had reported his plantation to be full of Indians committing every kind of havoc. I am with the highest esteem, your obedient servant, Daniel Beasley.
On the morning of August 30th, the sun rose at 5:27 a.m., and with this sunrise came the post rider to gather Beasley's previous day's reports. Survivors of the battle claimed that Beasley seemed drunk or in a hungover state of mind. Those claims were brought into light when mid-morning James Cornell's, Vicey McGurk's brother, rode up to the fort gates claiming to have seen a group of painted warriors just outside of the fields of Fort Mims. Beasley replied to Cornell's that he had just seen a gang of red cattle. Cornell's replied by saying, "Those cattle will give you a hell of a kick before night." As the midday meal drum sounded, Beasley arose from his deck of cards only to meet his fate at the fort's eastern gate. As the some 750 Creek warriors rushed the fort, Beasley tried to close the eastern gate that some say had been open for so long, sand from previous storms had lodged it into the open position, making it nearly impossible to close. Major Daniel Beasley was one of the first people to fall at Fort Mims on August 30th of 1813. In many ways, Beasley could have done more to prevent the fall of Fort Mims and to secure the inhabitants on the acre of ground. Unfortunately for him, his complacency on that day was awarded with his demise, along with nearly everyone inside the fort's demise as well. Could the Major have done things to prevent this slaughter? Absolutely he could have. He could have fixed the portholes that Claiborne ordered him to fix. He could have made sure that the eastern gate was closed at all times. And he could have absolutely been in a sober state of mind at the most crucial moment in his career. But these are things that we look back on today and realize how important it is to learn our history, so we aren't doomed to repeat it. Next week along the Wolf Trail, we will be right back here at Fort Mims, focusing our attention on the next important character in this docu-series, none other than the infamous William Weatherford. I hope y'all enjoyed this week's episode, and I can't wait to see y'all next time. Lord willing and the creeks don't rise.